Good morning, good afternoon. I would like, on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, Professor Daniel Pszastek, I would like to welcome all of you for today's seminar. A few days ago, we had inauguration of a new US presidential administration, and a few days ago, we started with our partners four-part series of joint international seminars, the Biden administration and the US global strategy. Together with our partners from New Zealand, Centre for Strategic Studies, Victoria University of Wellington, together with our partners from Israel, Center for National Security Studies, School of Political Science, University of Haifa, with our partners in Czech Republic, Department of North American Studies, Charles University from Mexico, CIDE, and also from the United States, the Polish European Academic Center for Exchange and Research, Northeastern Illinois University. We started also a few days ago discussion on implications for different parts of the world of the change in presidential administration in the United States. Few days ago, we have already discussed on transatlantic relations. We discussed also on Friday on US and Indo-Pacific. And yesterday, we discussed with our partners from Latin America. We discussed about United States and Latin America. Today it is our last seminar, and today we would like to focus on the Middle East, United States, new administration on and Middle East. We would like to ask our panelists to focus on three main questions. What is the current state of US relations with Middle East states? The second question, what expectations do states in the Middle East region hold regarding the Biden administration? And the last question, what possible major changes will a Biden administration make in American foreign policy towards Middle East? I'm very happy that our faculty, together with our partners, could have today's seminar, and I would like to say that we are very grateful Professor Benjamin Miller from University of Haifa for organizing today's seminar, and I would like also to give great thanks to my colleagues, Jan Hornat from Charles University, and also Professor Jarczewska from Department of Area and Global Studies of our faculty for preparing today's seminar. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Jan Hornat. He is a director of American Studies at the Faculty of Social Science of Charles University. He focused in his research on American foreign policy, and he will chair today a seminar. So I hope that it will be very fruitful discussion today, and I would like also to thank all panelists for accepting our invitation. But Jan will introduce each of our panelists today. So Jan, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Jakub, for the introduction. It is my great pleasure to be here today with you and to chair this wonderful panel. As you've heard from Jakub, this is the last seminar of the series that's focusing on the Biden's administration's relations with different regions of the world. And today we're looking at the Middle East. And we have quite a distinguished panel here today, and I'm really proud to be the chair of this panel. First up, I will introduce our panelists, and at the same time, I would also like to ask all our panelists to keep their videos on during the seminar, and all of those experts who are on the Zoom call with us, but who are not panelists, to maintain their cameras switched off during the seminar, unless they will be giving questions to our panelists. So to introduce our distinguished panelists, first up we have Professor Gregory Goss, the head of the International Affairs Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Then we have Professor Shibli Talami from the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, and also within the Center for the Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. So greetings to the United States. I'm actually calling in from the Czech Republic, where it's beautifully snowing outside of my window at this point. So next up, we have Professor Abraham Ben-Zvi from the School of Political Sciences at the University of Haifa. Thank you for joining us. Professor Benny Miller, head of the Center for National Security Studies at the School of Political Sciences at the University of Haifa. And last but not least, we have Professor Edward Halijak from the Department of Area and Global Studies at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw, who is also president of the Polish Association for International Studies. So before I pass the word on to our panelists, just a few notes on how the seminar will proceed. As I've mentioned, we have experts with us on the Zoom call. Once we give space to our panelists for the opening remarks, they will have about 10-12 minutes for their opening remarks. After these opening remarks, you can pose questions directly to our panelists on the Zooms. So just raise your virtual hand, turn on your microphone and your camera if you can, and you can pose questions directly. We also have viewers who are looking at us live stream through YouTube. So those of you who are watching us from YouTube, you can also pose questions in the chat function within YouTube, and we will and I will be the one collecting those questions and addressing them to our panelists. So without further ado, at this point, I would like to pass the word on to our panelists, and I will give them the word as they are mentioned in the program. So Professor Gregory Goss, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers on this very ambitious four-seminar, four-continent organizational mission. I'm very proud to be part of it. Thanks for inviting me. The charge was set out in the three questions that were part of the announcement of the seminar, and I don't think anybody in 10 minutes could handle all three. So I want to focus on the middle question, which is perceptions of the United States and of the incoming administration, kind of laying the groundwork for what the Biden administration is going to face in the Middle East. And I'm going to concentrate particularly in the Persian Gulf area, which is my area of expertise, and particularly on the Arab side of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf monarchies. There's a persistent belief on the Arab side of the Gulf that the United States is in the process of withdrawing from the Middle East. This perception has been around basically since the Obama administration. And I think that you can understand why folks there might think that. Both the Obama and the Trump administrations came into office saying that they basically wanted to, quote unquote, end the endless wars in the Middle East. President Obama came to political prominence in the Democratic Party and one could argue got the nomination for the presidency in 2008 because he had opposed the Iraq War of 2003, whereas then Senator Hillary Clinton had voted for it. And of course, Donald Trump was famously critical of his Republican predecessors in the George W. Bush administration for the Iraq War, and was very vocal in saying that he thought the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were, to use his exact words, stupid. So you could understand why people on the Arab side of the Gulf thought that the United States was lowering and lessening its commitment to the region. But it's very interesting to note that both those presidencies, the Obama presidency and the Trump presidency, despite the fact that they came in wanting to lower the American focus on the Middle East and the Gulf area, both ended up leaving office with the American military commitment in the region roughly the same. When President Obama left office, there were probably about 60,000 troops, American troops in the Middle East. President Trump left office a couple of weeks, or just last week, probably about 40,000 American troops in the Middle East. And still with American troops in Syria, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, although lower numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq. But you can understand why people on the Arab side of the Gulf are worried about the level of American commitment. I'll point to one particular incident that I think was not fully appreciated in the United States when it happened. And that was in September of 2019, when Iranian missiles attacked Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais. Now, this was front page news when it happened, but it didn't really affect the world oil market that much, and it kind of receded from view as a strategic event in the region, but not in the minds, I think, of people on the Arab side of the Gulf. Just to remind, Abqaiq is the single most important oil facility in the world. 5% of the world's oil supply, not Saudi Arabia's oil supply, of the world's oil production goes through the Abqaiq processing area to be readied for shipment out of Saudi Arabia and abroad. And the Iranian attack basically took Abqaiq out, not for long, a couple of weeks, but still, the fact that this escalation, I mean, never before had Iran directly attacked central oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. This escalation was perceived in Saudi Arabia as very dangerous. And the United States didn't do much. Right? I think that we can understand that this is part of an effort by Iran to create a crisis in order to try to bring international attention to the very severe system of sanctions that the Trump administration had placed on Iran. You might recall that the Iranians shot down an American drone. They had placed some mines on oil tankers and shipping outside of the Strait of Hormuz. And it didn't really get that much attention from the United States. And then the attack on Abqaiq. Now, the Trump administration, of course, retaliated much later with the missile strike in Iraq on Qasem Soleimani, killing Qasem Soleimani and the head of one of the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. But still, the idea that Iran could directly attack Saudi oil facilities and the United States react in such a mild way, when for decades the United States has said the reason that it is interested in the Persian Gulf is because of the free flow of oil, was, I think, quite startling to people on the Arab side of the Gulf. When I talk to my friends in the Gulf and they say, you Americans are leaving, you Americans are abandoning us, you Americans don't care about the Middle East anymore, my response to them is always, when the United States closes its base in Kuwait, when the Fifth Fleet leaves Bahrain, when Al Udeid Air Base, the biggest American air base in the Middle East in Qatar, which is located in Qatar, closes down, when the United States access agreements to facilities in the United Arab Emirates and Oman end, then we can talk about the United States leaving the region. So I think that this fear of American, quote unquote, abandonment of its Gulf allies in the face of Iran is greatly exaggerated. Nonetheless, it's real. I should also note that I think that the Abraham Accords, right, the the successful effort by the Trump administration to broker recognition by a number of Arab states, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Morocco, at the very end of the administration, the successful effort to broker their recognition of Israel, their formal diplomatic recognition of Israel, is another evidence of the continued centrality of the United States in the Persian Gulf region and in the Middle East as a whole. I'll speak specifically about Bahrain and the UAE, which I know more about. I think that the willingness of Bahrain and the UAE to take that final step and recognize Israel after some extensive amount of time in which these countries had had informal relations with Israel, non-public, but significant relations with Israel, is evidence that the United States is still central to their security, even though they might worry about American withdrawal. Because why did the UAE and why did Bahrain take this step at this time? It's because the United States administration pressed them to. The United States administration offered some side payments, as it were, especially to the UAE in terms of the sale of F-35 fighter jets. We also see that in Morocco and Sudan, in Morocco with the recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in the Western Sahara and the removal of Sudan from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. But I think that it shows this, if you will, this duality in the Gulf allies of the United States. The fear that America is leaving, but the continued recognition of the centrality of the United States. So the Biden administration faces a situation in the Gulf where they're very, very clear that they would like to renew the Iranian nuclear deal, renew American participation in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which limited the Iranian nuclear activities. I think that as opposed to the Obama administration, Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia and the smaller states are better prepared for that. It's not being sprung on them as a surprise, but they still worry that the United States is, in essence, trying to develop a new relationship with Iran as a replacement for its relationship with the Gulf side, the Arab side of the Gulf. I think this is a big exaggeration too. The question for the Biden administration as they approach Iran is, do they want to try to expand the range of issues in which they deal with Iran to include regional crises like Yemen, like the Syrian civil war, like Iraq, like the situation in Lebanon? We know from the first round of negotiations under the Obama administration, the Iranians didn't want to talk about those things, and understandably, because they were doing well in those areas. The Biden administration is going to have to decide how much it wants to focus these negotiations with Iran on a return to the nuclear deal, and how much it wants to try to placate allies in the Gulf, in Israel, by attempting to broaden the range of issues. I'm pessimistic, frankly, that we're going to get a clean return to the nuclear deal. Not just because of these complicated regional issues that the Biden administration might want to put on the table, but also because my read is that in Iran, there's going to be much more reluctance to just re-enter the deal as it was constructed. We're getting mixed signals from Iran on this, but we should note, and I'll end on this note, that the Iranians have their own elections coming up this summer for the presidency, and it will be the end of President Rouhani's term, and it'll be very interesting to see what develops in those elections. But I doubt very strongly that before those elections occur, you can have any kind of agreement between the United States, the new Biden administration, and Iran. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to Jan.
Thank you, Professor. The notion of perceptions and your discussion about the perception of Arab states and the United States sort of abandoning the region remind me of the discussions we're having here in Europe. Very similar, a very similar perspective, and sometimes even this perspective of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Sort of, well, we want the United States here, but when the United States is here, we criticize the United States for being here. So a bit of a paradox situation, which I see is very similar even with Arab countries. So, and next up, I would like to ask Professor Shibli Talami.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join this excellent panel, and nice to follow my friend and colleague, Gregory Gause, and to see my longtime colleague, Benny Miller there. Benny Miller and I were both graduate students at Berkeley at the same time. Both studied with Kenneth Waltz, actually, during that period. Let me just address, in a way, all three questions combined, rather than do what Gregory did, which is to focus on the perception. I'm going to look at it a little bit more from the view of the town in which I live, the Washington, D.C. area, and look at it particularly from the point of view of an emerging new administration, the Biden administration. So let me just state the obvious, which is, look, the Middle East, of course, is not going to be a top priority for this administration, no matter what. You know that the problems that the United States is facing at home, not the least of which is the pandemic, the economy, the racial issues, the big divide in America. And obviously foreign policy period is not particularly high on the priority list. And the Middle East certainly isn't going to be high on that list either, any of the issues. And the second part of that is that I think we can all agree that the Middle East has diminished in strategic importance, certainly since the end of the Cold War and since the Iraq War. And whether or not, people exaggerate, I agree with Gregory that people in the region exaggerate the degree to which the U.S. is sort of disengaging from the region. And the U.S. is not really fully disengaging, but there's some truth to the fact that the region is no longer as important strategically for the thinking of the United States, partly because oil doesn't play the same role. The Israeli-Arab conflict isn't as intense, and there isn't a burning question that could involve the United States directly, except for Iran, which I'll come back to briefly. But having said this, I am not one who ever believed that American foreign policy is principally or mostly driven by the strategic calculations. Administrations decide on their own what priorities to make. Sometimes those are strategically driven, sometimes they're domestically driven, sometimes they happen to depend on an accident of history. Let me give you an example. There is no question that if you look at an objective assessment in terms of distribution of power, national interest, that you could have made the argument the Trump administration were going to completely ignore or mostly ignore the Middle East. Now, as it turned out, not only did the US not ignore the Middle East, I could make the case that the Middle East became the top priority issue for the foreign policy of the Trump administration. And because to the extent that that there were issues that, North Korea, other issues, the president, trade with China, whether that was a policy or not, people here argue because they think it's, the peculiarities of the president. At that time, we have been, I am now co-authoring a book on the Trump presidency and the Obama presidency. We interviewed many of the people, top-level people in the Trump administration. And the picture we get is the same we get in the public, which is a president who is not really engaged in foreign policy or even the details of domestic policy. So this accident of history that happened was the fact that he had essentially allocated this issue to a son-in-law top advisor and his lawyer appointed ambassador to Israel, and essentially allowed them to map out the policies that with his support and blessing automatically, and having a Republican Party that was open to it, not driving it, but open to it. And you know, if you hear what Gregory said about, you know, so why do we have the Abraham Accords? Of course, it was because the U.S. Put the muscle into it. The U.S. Put the muscle in a way that we haven't seen on almost any issue, where you go into international organizations and you try to twist arms and use resources and incentives to bring about an agenda that was not principally driven by the strategic calculations of the United States. Let me just, I lost you all because somebody displayed a something on the screen, a little distracting. But I would say that that kind of calculation, like we've seen, that we saw in the Trump administration, is not likely to repeat itself under Biden. Even if Biden isn't going to make this issue a priority. So I want to talk more about sort of what are the likely, priorities for the Biden administration, that both not just ones that are driven by strategic imperatives, but also ones that reflect the ethos of the democratic elites around it. I think do not ever underestimate the extent to which American domestic politics impacts, influences, and sometimes shapes American foreign policy. And that is really key to understand here. First, there is no question the first issue is going to be the Iran issue. The Iran issue is critical because just as in the Obama administration, when Obama feared that there was a chance that the United States would be dragged into a war it did not want by allies, especially Israel, that he made that a priority to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal in order to prevent being dragged into a war. And I think now with Biden, there is that fear as well. We do know that Trump was being pushed by allies until his last days in office to initiate action against Iran. He resisted for whatever reason. This is one thing he claims is as an accomplishment. I think it is, in the sense that he, whatever his peculiarities, he had always resisted being dragged into major foreign wars, and he certainly was not dragged into one. So I think for that reason, the Biden administration will focus on this. And I think, Greg is right to say it's uncertain whether they'd be able to go unconditionally back into the nuclear deal. I think it's actually better than 50-50 chance. But here's the thing. We already see that the allies in the Middle East, meaning principally the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, are clearly not wanting Biden to go back without renegotiating. And renegotiating is practically impossible, particularly when you put it into, consider the possibility of that's being put on the table of limits on ballistic missiles, which I think is just improbable. I think Iran would defend its missiles before it would defend its nuclear rights. That's my own calculation. So it would be essentially going the path that will not end in an agreement. And I think for that reason, and knowing where the people are around Biden and Biden himself on this issue, I think it's likely that they will push to return without any conditions and figure out a path to get Iran to engage over these issues as they move forward. But I think it's an open question. And certainly the allies in the Middle East are making sure that this does not come to fruition. We already see it, by the way, even process-wise. One of the most able people around the Democratic elites, Robert Malley, who had advised Obama in the past and represented him on the Iran issue, is being considered to be the envoy for Iran. And we already see a lot of the allies from the Middle East, as well as people in the US who are supporting them, essentially attacking his appointment because he's considered to be way too conciliatory toward Iran. We don't know how this is going to turn out. I think that's going to be actually, in some ways, someone has not, there's someone who has not muted themselves. May I ask that they, because it's distracting. What I would say here is that that's an open question, but it's going to be the first one. The second one is going to be Yemen, not the Arab-Israeli issue in Yemen, because I think there's a huge sentiment in Congress to stop supporting the Saudi-Yemen war in Saudi-led war in Yemen. And that's going to be an issue, obviously, that's going to lead to even more friction. I will end with just some comments about the Arab-Israeli issue. Obviously, that is not a top priority issue right now for the administration. It's not even a top priority for the Arab states, as they have, you could see Arab states making peace with Israel without even making conditions or significant conditions for resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Nonetheless, I think the Obama administration has already, in a way, announced what it is likely to do. It certainly has opposed Israel's plan to annex the West Bank. This is the Trump plan, called it one-sided, had rejected it. They have rejected cutting off the aid to the Palestinians on humanitarian issues. They've rejected the closure of the Palestinian office in Washington. So those are things that are likely to shift, although not as easily as some think, because some of them require congressional approval, some don't. There are also laws that they have to consider in particularly in renewing aid to the Palestinian Authority. But all of that is possible and unlikely, in fact. But nonetheless, it is not, I cannot see a path in any foreseeable future where the administration would be in a position, given that it's going back to the two-state solution as advocated by the Obama administration before, that it has a path to move the needle forward. Keep in mind that Obama had 8 years, came in saying this is a priority issue, appointed a special envoy on day 2 of his administration. And 8 years later, the needle had not moved forward. And if anything, the possibility of two states had diminished, not increased. This administration isn't quite as forthcoming as Obama. There's been all the reversal that have taken place under Trump. And to expect that taking the same posture is going to move the needle forward is to not be realistic. I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Professor. It really seems that Iran is the elephant in the room. I would just like to reiterate those of you who are on the Zoom call to maintain your microphones off if you are not talking, so we don't get distracting background noises. Thank you very much. Next up, I would like to ask Professor Benjvi to offer his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Well, I think in approaching American foreign policy in general, and in the Middle East in particular, we sometimes used to speak in terms of a dichotomy, irreconcilability between fundamentally different poles or perceptual poles of action. And for example, we juxtapose between, of course, Woodrow Wilson's utopian vision to change Europe and to create a new system predicated upon the notion of democracy, liberalism, self-determination. And of course, when you push this paradigm to the limit, there was a backlash in the form or in the way in which Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge disengaged completely from world affairs and so on and so forth. For example, President Nixon pushed to the limit the notion of realpolitik, and then came Carter, and at least initially envisioned the different world based upon the notion of ethics and human rights, etc. In our case, it's very easy and tempting to juxtapose between Trump and Biden and to see them as opposite poles, not just in terms of liberalism and realism, because it's very difficult to pinpoint what exactly Trump is what was his motivation? Can we somehow link him or integrate him into any paradigmatic concept? But basically, we tend to draw almost irreconcilable distinctions. And I'm following Professor Gauss. I believe that actually both Obama, President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden did and will react to the same geopolitical vision of the Middle East, and basically with the same agency or need to at least partially withdraw in the wake of the Iraqi debacle or even trauma. Obviously, in terms of the tactics pursued, they differed fundamentally from one another, but essentially they wanted to disengage, although ultimately at the end of the day, as Professor Tellamy pointed out, the Middle East came maybe to haunt them, or they became drawn into the Middle East predicament. But so my point of departure is that there is no dichotomy. There is some continuity, although later on, of course, and in terms of the tactics pursued, the difference became very evident. Concerning Trump, I think that Trump, although there was no staff work, although it looked chaotic, and it was chaotic up to an extent, I do not believe really, and I think that Professor Tellamy gave too much credit to David Friedman. I think policy originated in the White House, and I think it was the turning point was Trump's visit to Riyadh in May 2017. And I think he perceived, he felt the vulnerability of the Gulf states and the shift in terms of priorities. And I think unlike Obama and the last 8 years of Obama in power were based on the notion that the Palestinian issue was a prerequisite for any breakthrough concerning the issue of normalization. And the idea was, let's make progress on the Palestinian issue and the rest will follow. I think that Trump, to the extent that he was original, he reversed the order of things because he perceived that the Middle East changed radically, also in terms of OPEC lost its centrality, and of course dependence of oil declined, and of course the threat perception of Iran increased. As a result, he kind of engineered the notion, not perhaps himself, which culminated in the Abraham Accords, namely, let's have normalization and let's relegate or downplay the Palestinian issue and offer to the Palestinians something, not today, not tomorrow, perhaps in 3 years, but at least something which enabled the Gulf states to get out of the closet and normalize relations with Israel, with the idea of joining hands again, primarily to establish a security coalition against the Iranian threat. So this was, I think, the innovative thing about Trump. Concerning Israel, whatever he did was not predicated upon pro-Israeli considerations, but pro-evangelist considerations, the evangelist vote rather than the Jewish vote, which declined, I think, significantly during the last couple of decades. But I think so. First of all, there was the reversal of the order of things. Number two, I think there was a strategic notion in Trump's worldview. Namely, I don't know if you ever heard the name of George Frost Kennan, but it was predicated upon the notion of very limited, a very limited version of containment. Namely, we focus, we concentrate. It's a focused containment. We focused on a number of threats, of course, North Korea, Iran, by virtue of posing a direct and imminent danger to American interests, national security interests, not Israeli. The potential capacity of producing weapons of mass destruction, plus the potential of exporting terrorism. These were the criteria. And this is why he changed dramatically the policy toward Iran, of course, left the Vienna Accord and embarked on a series of intrusive sanctions against Iran, which didn't really succeed. So in this respect, and against this backdrop, I think a change is in the making. Biden administration is likely, again, with all emphasis on the need to withdraw from Middle East, at least partially withdraw, and obviously in the light of many other more pressing objectives, I think that he will try to return, well, maybe to manage the Middle East, not to withdraw from the Abraham Accords, but of course to proceed in implementing them with less enthusiasm. And I think we will hear naturally, we will see a return to the traditional tenets of American Middle Eastern diplomacy, namely emphasis on multilateralism, not unilateralism, to proceed under the framework of broad or international security organization, other organizations. This was a traditional American policy. Also, emphasis on the Palestinians, maybe not as a precondition or prerequisite, as Obama saw it as a prerequisite, but as a central tenet or ingredient which should be handled at the beginning of the process, not toward the end. And also, I think since some of the central figures in Biden's high policy elite served under Obama and under Biden, obviously, they are pragmatists, they are not utopians, they are not idealists. They know the limits of what can be accomplished. So I think that Biden would move very cautiously. He would try, first of all, to avoid, I guess, to manage the risks and to avoid any ambitious initiatives. Obviously, he would like very much to return to the Vienna Accords with obvious some modifications. I don't know if they are feasible, but obviously he would focus much more on diplomatic negotiations, soft power, old-style negotiations. The focus of, again, we must see it in perspective. China is a center, Russia less so, but I guess he will be preoccupied in shaping American foreign policy with China, and of course the dilemma whether to confront China or maybe integrate China into a new world order. The Middle East will be relegated unless it will become a source of imminent crisis. Concerning Israel, I think it will be back to normal. We will not see effusive gestures of goodwill. It will be, we will hear more and more, again, the boundaries, 67 borders, with maybe few modifications. We will see criticism. We'll see more emphasis on the Palestinians. 242 will emerge into the background. Trump, maybe because he was so ignorant, he was oblivious to them completely, or just downgraded them completely. Since he operated outside the box, I don't think he was a leader of a political party. He was a leader of a political movement, a protest movement, ironically. Now it's over, and I think his era will recede very quickly into the background. And so it's back to normal, traditional, conventional diplomacy. I don't expect too much, but it will be basically more cautious, risk avert, and I don't anticipate any breakthrough. Maybe in the case of Iran, but I'm not really an expert on Iran. I don't know how difficult the economic situation is domestically, but I don't anticipate dramatic changes, just some departures from Trump, but without abandoning what had been accomplished, namely the Abraham Accords will continue to be, I would say, kind of a roadmap, but without a special enthusiasm or desire, because this was not Biden's baby. He will adopt it, but pursue peace in other means, other ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I would like to pass the word to Professor Miller, who I believe has a PowerPoint presentation prepared for us, if I'm right.
Correct.
I'll share it now with us.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be on the same panel with three distinguished scholars, colleagues and friends, Shibli Talhami, whom I've known for many years. Greg goes also for quite a few years, and obviously Avi, whom I know forever. And yeah, it's really a great honor and a great pleasure. What I would like to do is to try to expect what will be the likely Biden administration strategy, but to do it in comparison with earlier administrations, but to start with trying to define kind of the American grand strategy in different periods, in 4 periods, and then to look at their key manifestation in the Middle East and what we can expect of Biden. My argument will be that the Biden strategy will be different from all his key predecessors. The realist, the liberal, and nationalist, more or less the 3 major preceding grand strategies. It will be more kind of, to some extent, an integration, a very delicate and a very complicated kind of integration between some realist elements as well as some liberal elements, but all of them in a new context that I will try to specify. So let me do the share screen, starting with the kind of the overall picture of American grand strategy since the beginning of the Cold War, very briefly looking at that, and the explanation for that, and then the manifestation into the manifestation of the grand strategy into the Middle East, and maybe to look at Iran as a key case separating, distinguishing between these 4 periods: Cold War, post-Cold War, the Trumpist, and then the future Biden. Okay. Okay, so I hope everyone can see it. Okay, so my argument will be that the Biden 2, the new Biden, will be different from Biden 1, from Biden back then until 2016, part of the liberal elite, liberal foreign policy elite. It will be quite different, obviously, from Trump and from the earlier. Okay, very briefly looking kind of, we have 4 periods, including the future Biden, and what is the key explanation? In the Cold War, confronting a great power competitor, the Soviet Union, obviously, you don't have much choice but to follow realpolitik grand strategy, focusing on the balance of power. In the post-Cold War, the United States emerged as the hegemon. This was the era of liberal hegemony, basically a democracy promotion, and trying to build international institutions and strengthen them. Free trade, as much as free trade as possible, multilateralism and globalization, the economic, cultural, and institutional, and migration, the various elements of the international liberalism. And the explanation was simple. The United States could do it. It was the hegemon, and it's a liberal hegemon, at least until the era of Trump. Okay, Trump comes to power. This is a completely different strategy, but actually, it was partly because of the failures and the disenchantment in large parts of American society from the liberal hegemony, including some of the key manifestations in the Middle East, most notably the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the implication of that, and the high price the United States paid in blood and treasure for that intervention, and all the instability in the Middle East that at least partly caused by this intervention. Also the other intervention, Afghanistan, Libya, 2011, Afghanistan, 2001, and so on, didn't do too well, put it modestly. This nationalist America First have a number of characters, the Trumpist grand strategy. Put it very kind of briefly, we can say, basically focusing on material gains for the United States in a going forever zero-sum game. There is always someone who wins and someone who loses. The United States, because of its economic and military advantages, always has to be in the winner side, and the other side must lose. What are the kind of the overall international systemic context for that grand strategy? Even though it was derived, at least partly from domestic factors in the United States, still we have to look to understand the international system, because I think it does affect in major ways American behavior, including in the Middle East. First of all, an era of power transition started. the rising of the others, the rising of the other great powers, a number of them, but by far the most important, as will be very important for Biden, is the emergence of China finally as a great power competitor. And about the other key factor, systemic factor, the question of the balance of threat, what happened was that part of the cleavages in American society, there also emerged cleavage about identification. What is the key national security threat confronting the United States? Whereas before it was clear, either the Soviet Union or terrorism or so on, now for the first time there was disagreement. Is it China because it's the most powerful? Is it Russia because it's violating liberal norms and trying to discredit liberal democracy? Or is it identity threats related to terrorism, migration, and all of that? And that was the Trumpist card. What we can expect from the Biden grand strategy before we go to the Middle East? I think it will be a very delicate and difficult attempt to reconcile two contradictory elements. On the one hand, on the geopolitical level, Biden must pursue, he will be compelled by the international system to follow a realist grand strategy. And that was somewhat similar, with a lot of differences, but some similarity to the Cold War. Confronting a great power competitor because of the rise of China, you must focus on the balance, on the global balance of power. And that will have influence everywhere, not only in Asia Pacific, which will become the most important region by far, and the Middle East will decline in importance, but there will be also implication to the Middle East. But another major change is the rise of completely new type of threats. These are the transnational global threats that threaten humanity. We see it now during the pandemic, climate change, and also nuclear non-proliferation, which obviously links us to the Middle East and to the Iranian issue. And in this, confronting this type of elements, Biden will pursue a liberal grand strategy. Why? Because you must. I mean, you can't cope with climate change without cooperation with China. China and the United States are by far the greatest polluters in the world. Similarly, pandemic, you can't cope with it without cooperation with China. And also in non-proliferation, you must cooperate with the other great powers. Let's see now some of the manifestation of these four grand strategies in the Middle East. Going very briefly, but maybe looking at Iran particularly in different periods. Cold War, balance of power, obviously containing Soviet penetration into the region, establishing and leading in different way anti-Soviet alliances and also anti-Soviet clients like the Arab so-called socialist country back at that time, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and so on. But very interestingly, we must look and must understand why it was a realist grand strategy. Because in a realist logic, you might not only not promote democracy, that's for obvious, look at the alliance with Saudi Arabia, but you might also undermine democracy if you consider this democratically elected government as posing a threat to your national interest. And that's what happened in 1953 in Iran, deposing Mossadegh, the democratically elected government of Mossadegh, and imposing the Shah of Iran and a very authoritarian government. And that, by the way, has major implication to US-Iranian relation until today. You cannot understand one major source of the hatred in Iran towards the United States without realizing that the United States was in charge, was responsible for establishing the Shah, the very authoritarian regime of the Shah in Iran in 1953. But anyway, this undermining of democracy is the opposite of what the United States tried to do in the post-Cold War era. So we see the difference in the implication of a realist grand strategy versus a liberal grand strategy. Because what the United States, the innovation of the American post-Cold War grand strategy is the invention of the liberal interventions in two ways. One is the democracy promotion, and the second one is humanitarian intervention. That is a novel development in international relations, that you use force not because of geostrategic or not because defending your citizen or any other realpolitik clear-cut interest, but in order to promote liberalism in in different ways. So that was a major manifestation of American strategy in the Middle East in this post-Cold War era. Obviously, liberalism, multilateralism is very important, and international cooperation. And the key manifestation, obviously, is the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, together with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. Also, peacemaking, very important as part of a liberal grand strategy, but to do it multilaterally. We see the 1991 Madrid conference, which initiated the establishment of kind of a liberal functional logic of establishing working group, international Arab-Israeli Palestinian working group, in order to deal with various problems in the Middle East. Obviously the Jordan-Israeli peace in 1994, and the Palestinian became a part of the idea of the two-state solution, became a cornerstone of the American grand strategy in this post-Cold War era. Now, when Trump came to power, he came with this kind of illiberal unilateralism, completely different from the liberal grand strategy. Again, partly, at least, because of the sense of the failure of this liberal hegemony, international liberalism pursued by different administrations, both Republican and Democrats, not only Democrats. George W. Bush obviously did a lot to promote democracy because of the special context of the post 9/11. So it was a bipartisan actually policy, at least for a while, until the Trumpist era. And we see the huge changes under Trump. First of all, the alliance and the love affair with despotic allies, rather than with authoritarian leaders, rather than promoting democracy, moving the opposite direction completely don't care, not caring at all about human rights, about democracy, and actually having, and in the Middle East, obviously the key manifestation is with the Gulf, Sunni state, and with Egypt, obviously, which Egypt was now a much more authoritarian regime than was under Mubarak. And as Trump calls the Egyptian authoritarian leader, his favorite authoritarian leader. Then about Iran, again, Iran plays a central role in all this different strategy. Obviously, unilateral withdrawal from the Iran's nuclear deal, the maximum pressure policy, imposing heavy sanction on Iran. And for the, yes, Trump has done his share supposedly in order to promote peace, but again, it's in the logic of the unilateral. It's one-sided peace process, whatever favors Israel, and more precisely, what favors the Netanyahu government, and actually Benjamin Netanyahu himself, either reducing completely the importance of the two-state solution and the Palestinian issue, and removing it to the sidelines, completely sidelining the Palestinian and the two-state solution by the supposedly the deal of the century, which really wasn't a deal and didn't offer really an actual road in order to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And at the same time, the Abraham Accords and these various peace agreements definitely fitting very nicely with the Netanyahu logic, which say that basically our relation with Arabs, both externally and internally in Israeli politics, by the way, as we see in recent weeks, is based on the economic peace. We are doing peace with Arabs who are pragmatic, who are interested in maximizing their economic fortune, whether it's Arab citizens of the state of Israel, as we see now nearing the elections in Israel, as well as we see with the Arab state, and we are against Arab nationalists, those Arabs who care about Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, and so on. We try to sideline them, to remove them from our agenda. What about the Biden future gun strategy? I call it realist liberalism. First of all, because of realpolitik, the Middle East will become a low priority. And actually, there are three major reasons for that. One is obviously Asia Pacific. the pivot to Asia, that the shift of the geostrategic priority of the United States is moving by far to that region. That also actually means that Europe will be less important, relatively speaking, but definitely the Middle East. The second factor is the energy independence. The United States now is energy independent. Still, Middle Eastern oil obviously is still important for the global oil market, energy market, and so on and so forth. But for the United States itself, it's now much less important. So that's also a concern. And secondly, is this disenchantment of American society from whatever related to the Middle East, especially with regard to military deployment, to use of force, to any military or anything related to that engagement in the region. So under this low priority, what we can expect about the liberal agenda. Biden, as opposed to Trump, will be critical of human rights violations. And that's important. He will criticize the United Arab Emirates and especially the Saudis internally, and particularly the war in Yemen, that actually also in the American Congress, there is a strong opposition to it, and Trump tried to fight against this opposition and this criticism of Saudi Arabia, but now it will be very important in Biden. But at the same time, there will be, and that's the realist argument, the dimension, there will be no liberal intervention. That's the end of the liberal intervention, even though Biden won, Biden before 2016 and earlier, also as the chair of the Senate Relations Committee, was in favor of this type of intervention. Now there is no chance that the United States will repeat to go back to this intervention, but multilateralism will play an important role, and that the key manifestation, again, it's Iran and the attempt to restore the Iran deal. Obviously, as my colleagues also pointed out, there are a number of difficulties about it, and extreme difficulties. First of all, that will be the key Middle Eastern issue in the Biden administration by far. And Biden will try to restore the agreement. The problems are the following one. On the one hand, there is a strong pressure to extend the agreement, the so-called sunset, the end of the limitation on the Iranian nuclear buildup, to extend it, and also to apply to the ballistic missile and to Iranian regional intervention. Obviously, Iran will oppose all this vehemently. Then Iran will demand end of sanction. I mean, if you go back to the deal, please, and the American, this heavy sanction that Trump imposed on us. But that will mean that, Biden won't have any means of pressure against Iran if he immediately abandon all sanction on Iran. So it will be a very difficult road, but that will be probably the center of Middle Eastern, the Biden Middle Eastern policy, obviously confronting strong opposition by a strong alliance in this respect of Israel and the Gulf Sunni states, and it wouldn't be easy. With regard to peacemaking, it will be a low profile. A declaration in favor of the two states and more assistance to the Palestinian Authority, and so on and so forth, but on the whole, it will be low profile. I will conclude very briefly just to show the logic, overall logic of all these strategies based on two factors. Does the United States confront great power competitor or not? And what are, in a very general terms, what are the key threats that the United States is confronting? Once you have a great power competitor and traditional national security threat, it means threat of violence, either by state or by non-state factors. Then you realist balance of power, and that's the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, no great power competitor, and there was the start of the thinking about the global threat that led to this kind of defensive liberal globalization institution type of strategy. After 9/11, back to the violence type of threat, but by non-state actors that produced what I call the offensive liberal ground strategy, regime change. And again, the Middle East is the key manifestation of it with the 2000 Iraq intervention. Biden will have a great power competitor for sure, China, and that will be the realist dimension which dominate the geopolitical strategy of the administration. But because of the rise, now for sure, the rise of the transnational global threats, there will be a strong liberal elements of international cooperation, multilateralism, and international institution as well. How to reconcile the two? Obviously, even though the Biden team is extremely talented, extremely experienced, it will be very tough to reconcile, and that will be a very big challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful theoretical perspective on the incoming Biden's administration's options in foreign policy making. So last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Professor Halajak, but before that, I would also like you to prepare your questions for the panelists because we are nearing the end of the opening remarks and it will be your turn to ask questions. So once again, those of you who are on Zoom, raise your hands. Those of you who are watching us through YouTube, you can write your questions in the chat. And now I pass the final word to Professor Halajak.
Thank you. I argue that the United States will be confronted with severe challenges in the near future coming from the Middle East region. I am very, pessimistic on this, on the development in this region because of many security threats for the United States as well as for the whole world in the form of rising authoritarian regimes in this region. Besides, the character of threats coming from this region has not changed from the 2003 when the Barnett proposed a famous map in the form of gap as a source of insecurity, embarrassment for the whole world. I argue that nothing has changed, and in this region, as a form of regional security complex, there are a few structural sources of insecurity which has not been resolved by international community, including the United States, unfortunately. Almost all states in the region are pursuing offensive realist strategy, and they are not punished for this, but instead of it, they are rewarded by the outside global powers. For instance, Turkey, as a new source of instability, is rewarded by Russia, Saudi Arabia by the United States, Iran by Russia and China, Pakistan by China and the United States. The second source is eternal war between Shia and Sunni, which is the source of radical religion movements. And each of these radical movements has its own state sponsors. Wahhabi, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and Islamic States. They are, they're described as a transnational movement, but they are state foreign agents, which are pursue interest of regional states. And the third, form is increasing intra-regional competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is the well-known, but there is a newcomer, that is the Turkey. Turkey, NATO member, behave, behave in a very offensive way, fueled by the Turkish nationalism. So the question is how the United States would react in this new circumstances, given the fact that all U.S. strategies failed to prevent against destabilization of this region. What will be the United States new approach? I rely on an article written by Joseph Biden 1 year ago in Foreign Affairs. He wrote that the main priority for the United States will be organizing global summit for democracy to counter authoritarian regime. I agree with my predecessor that it means that a liberal approach in US foreign policy will be back. But what does it mean in the context of the Middle East? Which country from the Middle East will be invited, except for Israel, to participate in such a global summit? Egypt will be eligible, Iraq will be eligible, or maybe Iran will be eligible, given the fact that the new presidential election, will come soon. And this election, looks like rather in a fair way. In my opinion, such idea will bring about a new division in a region, division between democratic states, those support democracy, and authoritarian ones. So I am not very optimistic about this coming back of liberalist approach in U.S. foreign policy. Of course, liberal intervention is excluded, but historical experience show us that it was always source of division and competition. The second aim, according to this article, the second aim was Iran. And let me quote what Biden wrote. I am under no illusion about the Iranian regime. The recent killing of Qasem Soleimani, commander of Quds Force, removed a dangerous actor, but also raised the prospect for an ever-escalating cycle of violence in the region, and it has prompted Iran to jettison the nuclear limits established under the nuclear deal. So, if we assume that the United States will start a negotiation with Iran to renewal agreement, so how it would be consistent with another part of a US strategy, that is the regime change. From all sources, I learned that this strategy is a US obsession to change regime, especially in Iran. I knew this country very, very well, and this by all Iranians, including hardliners, as well as Iranian liberals. because there are, you know, in Iranian establishment, liberals who want to come in agreement with the United States. So they strongly afraid of a regime change. If the United States will put a stress on a regime change, there will be no progress in stabilizing relations with the Iran. Former speakers pay a lot of attention . I agree. This is the in the Middle East regional complex, because without engaging and integrating Iran, there will be no peace in this region. The problem is very challenging, because slowly but steadily the Middle East is converting into the area of a confrontation between the United States and China. China is pursuing very active policy toward the Iran in order to convert this country into the informal ally of this country. A strategic partnership is a good, you know, indicators of this new approach. So the new approach toward the Iran will have to rely on engaging, but with also with some sort of a coercion, because the approach will have to be addressed to those segments of society in Iran which are more open, more liberal, and want real, you know, real rapprochement with the Western countries, especially with the United States. United States will have to balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and this is the one greatest challenge for the United States, and the United States will have to do something with this historical opportunity to resolve this endless conflict with Iran. The second approach, or the revolutionary idea, is a concept formulated by the British scholars from Oxford University. The idea of organizing a called Westphalia for the Middle East. This idea is very popular among European, German, and British scholars, and attract a growing interest. So why it would be a revolutionary idea? Because Iran and Saudi Arabia will participate, and also Israel and Palestine, along with Hezbollah, and of course outside power, the United States and China and Russia. So my question by the end of my presentation is such: is this a political fiction or the political reality? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Halajak, and for that rhetorical question at the end, which I assume that some of the panelists will want to react to. But At this point, I would very much like to turn to our audience because I have some questions lined up here and I see some hands up. So the way I'm going to do this is that some of these questions are going to be unaddressed. So I'm just going to pose them and whoever wishes to answer from the panelists can. And if some of our viewers have a question directed at one of the panelists, I will ask that right away, right? So the first question that I have here in line is from Tomasz Lukaszuk, who is asking about U.S. cooperation with the European Union on Middle Eastern issues. He's asking how the U.S. might restart the cooperation on the Middle East issues with the European Union. And can we even speak of a restart? Right? Yes, the U.S. has cooperated with the EU on the Iran nuclear deal, but is this something that perhaps the Biden administration would be willing to go into, right? And if it's necessary, actually, for the United States to cooperate and work with the EU on Middle Eastern issues in general. So I will propose that question out to the panel. And we'll pick up another question from the audience to have two questions which you can tackle in the panel. So first up, I would like to ask Wojciech Grabowski, who had his hand up first. Wojciech? No? Okay, then I see next in line is Paulina Warsaw. Yes.
Yes, good afternoon. I would like to ask Professor Goss, or maybe other interested scholars, about the perception or maybe misperception of American policy towards Middle East in Iraq. As I assume we all know, 4 days ago there was a first big attack with civilian casualties on the market in central Baghdad, and the reaction of the, let's say, Iraqi public was, oh great, Biden is 4 days president and we already have a terrorist attack in the central Baghdad with a couple of dozen casualties. Of course, it's an exaggeration and we all understand that, but the question is, because from my interlocutors, from my expertise, is like some of the public opinion in the Middle East were understanding the Trump policy as, for example, pro-Iraqi one. And of course, it was very difficult to discuss that it's not a pro-Iraqi one, it's anti-Iranian because it's pro-Israeli one and pro-Saudi one. And so now what can be development or any try to put more or less pressures or on the Iraqi government that's now have to administrate very serious reforms, including economic ones, because the Iraqi economy is on the verge of collapse, with the main emphasis of its public sector that was very, very out of proportion after the demise of Saddam regime. So my question is there any real mechanism, or are there any tools that US will be willing to use to try to, let's say, diminish the influence of Iranian militia, for example, or try to initiate any real changing the dynamics within Iran, or we can just expect the more of the same? Because of course certain observers are accusing the so-called ISIS cells for that terrorist attempt, but other observers are thinking about Iranian militias that were trying to mitigate potential change between US and Iran.
Thank you very much, Paulina. And we'll take a third question from Wojciech, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry for the temporary problems. I would like to also thank all distinguished guests for the assessment of the American foreign policy toward the Middle East and the current state of knowledge about this region. I have two questions. One to the Professor Gregory Gause. How do you think President Biden assessed the recent actions of the Mohammed bin Salman, meeting Qatar and the reapproachment with the Qatar and yesterday meeting with the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan? Do you think that these steps will open the door to cooperation between these two countries, between the Saudi Arabia and United States? And the second question for all distinguished guests, if the United States decides to lead a passive foreign policy toward the Middle East, will the Israel and Saudi Arabia take matters into their own hands, like it was after the Arab Spring? And what actions will Israel and Saudi Arabia take towards Iran in a situation of passive US foreign policy toward the Middle East, especially when Biden will sit to the table for talks with Iran about the nuclear program? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. So in the end, we have 4 questions, and the panelists can address them in whichever order or whichever question they wish. So we have a question on the U.S. cooperation with the EU in the Middle East. We have a question that was addressed to Gregory on the perceptions of the U.S. in Iraq. Then we have a question on U.S. relations and perceptions of Mohammed bin Salman's latest activities. And the last one, in case of passive U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, what is Israel and Saudi Arabia going to do in a proactive manner? And I think we can start with Professor Gause, who was addressed in one of the questions, and move on to other panelists. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll do this telegraphically because we want to get as many questions in and as many comments. I think the Iraq issue is symptomatic of the larger crisis in the region. I think from my perspective, the origin of the current crisis that the region is living through and has been really throughout the 2010s is the collapse of state authority and the weakening of state authority in so many parts of the Arab world. Right, that weakening of state authority acts almost as a political vacuum, drawing in the interventions of ambitious regional powers, be it Turkey, be it Iran, be it the Emirates and Saudi, and being the Qataris, you name it, everyone's involved, right? And if you only have a couple of places in the region, like a Lebanon historically, where that's the reality, you can have a more ordered regional system because you have real states that can defend their borders and act as independent actors. But in the current circumstance, with so many political vacuums, Libya, Yemen, to some extent Iraq, Syria to some extent, Lebanon traditionally, the Palestinian Authority divided as it is, I think it's very difficult to have a Westphalia, to have a political order, because there are too many playing fields and not enough actors. And this, I think, is the problem with Iraq. The fundamental problem of the American intervention was that it was really easy to knock down Saddam Hussein's government, but really, really difficult to rebuild something in its place. And that was the hubris of the American invasion, the thought that it would be easy to replace Saddam's government with a stable, pro-American, friendly Iraqi state that was at peace with Israel and allied to the United States. That was the pipe dream. And unfortunately, the United States doesn't really have any good solutions to these countries for the rebuilding of state authority. We know historically that the rebuilding of state authority is it's a long-term, frequently violent process done by really nasty people. And the problem is that the United States really doesn't have either the money or, even more importantly, the ideas of how to rebuild state authority in Iraq. And thus I fear that while the Biden administration is going to be supportive of the Baghdad government, it doesn't really have much it can give that government in an effort to rebuild its own authority. And so Iraq is going to remain a flashpoint in which the Iranians do not want to get, I mean, the Iranians fought for decades, if you will, to become the dominant power in Iraq. And they're not going to give that up easily. And while the United States would like to see, any administration in the United States would like to see Iranian power in Iraq rolled back, I really don't think that the United States has that much going for it right now to be able to help the Iraqis. On the whole MBS issue in Saudi Arabia, I think Dr. Rojek was absolutely right that the movement to end the Qatar crisis was both an effort to give the Trump administration something that they've wanted on the way out, because the Saudi relationship, the personal relationship between MBS and Jared Kushner and President Trump was so strong, but also an effort to, if you will, clean up the Saudi copybook for the new administration. The Qatar issue was the easiest one to do. Yemen will be much harder. And of course, human rights issues in Saudi Arabia, even more difficult. The meeting between the Turks and the Saudis is very interesting because the Turks and the Saudis are rivals. They're ideological rivals and geopolitical rivals. But with the Qatar crisis over, maybe the Turks are willing to look at a more cooperative relationship with Saudi Arabia. There was a brief time when King Salman came to power in early 2015 where there looked like there might be a Saudi-Turkish cooperation against Iran and Syria. But I don't put much stock in long-term long-term Turkish-Saudi rapprochement because of those fundamental ideological differences. The Turks really do Erdogan represents a bottom-up populist Sunni Islam, and the Saudis represent the opposite of that.
If I may, I can respond to the question about the EU cooperation with the Biden administration. I think that obviously, if you look back prior to the Trump administration, there was always some cooperation with the EU. And obviously, there was this process called the Quartet that included the EU throughout the Obama administration and before. And some of that is likely to be revived because, as you know, not only is Biden not likely to make Arab-Israeli peacemaking or Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking a priority, but he's certainly want to be multilateral, and he wants to rebuild the relationship with the EU on multiple issues, including this one. But that really doesn't solve the fundamental problem, because the EU is unlikely to become a central player to advance the needle on Israel policy. And there are two reasons for it. One reason is the EU itself, right? It's made up of states, and they have varying degrees of leverage that they're, some want to use it, some don't. It's not a coherent policy with a lot of muscle behind it vis-a-vis this issue. But the second and more important is the reason why the US has been so critical is that the US is Israel's principal enabler, like no others. The EU doesn't have that, cannot play with that, meaning what? One of the reasons why Israel has been empowered to be able to withstand international pressure on occupation, particularly and settlements, is that the US constantly employs the veto power, whether it's Democrat or Republican administration, to protect Israel at the UN from any consequences of those actions. That American veto power is the absolutely central, first of all, in enabling Israel, and the EU can't do anything about that. And the second is the technological edge that Israel gets in its military from the US. That no one else has, that always have the upper hand technologically. The military that Israel has with American aid is going to be superior. Those two structural things that are not really changing, and I don't see Biden changing them, are just going to leave very little for the European to do. So I think there's room for cooperation, and the EU can obviously use whatever instruments it can to advance a more equitable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least change the situation that particularly the desperate humanitarian situation on the ground in the short term. But I think the U.S. remains really dominant in that regard, by virtue of its posture, by virtue of its support for Israel, by virtue of its relationship with Israel.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists? Yes.
Okay. Number one, I think that obviously the US will embark on a collaborative posture vis-a-vis the European Union, because number one, it's a byproduct of its approach toward Iran. If it wants to resume negotiations, if it wants to return to the Vienna Treaty, obviously it's going to be on a broad multilateral basis. So if the US cooperates with Europe on this front, it will continue to collaborate with Europe on other fronts. And of course, there is a long history of collaboration, of collaborative moves, but it was largely confined to the rhetorical level. For example, take various resolutions of the Middle East, beginning with the Venice Declaration, etc., etc. They were not translated into action. Although I think there was a significant difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And Obama, toward the end, he crossed the line or reached the watershed by abstaining from vetoing Resolution 2334. And actually, again, it didn't have any tangible ramifications vis-a-vis Israel, but it set a new, I would say, new ground rules. So I wouldn't completely discount a collaboration between the US and Europe. Of course, it will be confined to purely soft power. It's not going to be demonstrated in Libya. It was not only a European adventure, but it was under the auspices of the United Nations. But obviously, in terms of using soft power initiatives on the Palestinian front, there will be efforts to coordinate strategies. Again, Obama was maybe deviant in the sense that he was much more critical of Israel, but again, still he provided Israel long-term package of security, of the security earmarked for 10 years. Finally, concerning Iraq, I think it's also interrelated. Everything is somehow interrelated or connected or linked to Iran. Namely, I don't anticipate any miracles, and I'm quite realistic, but basically returning to the, I guess, American tragedy, which was inherent in basically ethnocentric concept about exporting democracy as if it was Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola, without, in the absence of any democratic institutions, infrastructures in Iran. And now the question is, obviously, it led to the fragmentation, disintegration of the Iraqi state, of Iraqi nationality. So to the extent that some improvement can be made, probably the Biden administration will seek to do it through Iran. An agreement with Iran, which would also cover conventional insurgency, or I would say would probably help to limit Irani intervention, although it's a bit too little and too late, because the Iranians are controlling much of the body politics of Iraq. But I think the key in Biden's view would be accommodation, diplomacy, which would perhaps delimit, restrain Iran, by the way, by the offering of positive sanctions, inducements, rather than radical sanctions, which didn't bear fruit, at least for the time being. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's identify what are the key games in the Middle East and what are the key camps. I think what happened in the 21st century and the whole in the Middle East is a major power shift. Whereas in the 20th century, especially in the post-colonial era, the Arab world was the dominant regional force. What happened in the 21st century is that the three non-Arab states in the Middle East became the key regional players, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And that's more or less the key kind of power game on the regional level. But then we have to head the international game. And I think here, okay, US and Europe, some cooperation for sure, there will be more or less in the same camp, especially under Biden. But the question is, what about China? Will there be a formation of an alliance, according to balance of power logic, between Iran, China and Iran, according also to their 2016 agreement against the US, the Sunni states, and Israel? Will there be such a balance of power game? That's one possibility. But for the short term, the key game will be the United States and Europe, with some support of China and Russia, trying to revive the Iran nuclear deal, while the Sunni states and Israel try to put obstacles or try to demand major revision in the nuclear accord, or if that fails, trying to exert pressures on the United States to use force against Iran. Then the other force in the Middle East is the Muslim Brotherhood, led by Turkey and Qatar and the various Muslim Brotherhood forces in the movement in the region, which were suppressed. They were one of the losers of the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt, but also in Syria and so on. So the question whether this kind of intra-Sunni competition between the Sunni authoritarian states and Turkey, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood movement, will it be kind of more intensified? Because that's another key game which will shape the future of the Middle East, between purely authoritarian versus kind of nationalist democracy in the very limited sense of democracy, kind of the Muslim Brotherhood. And obviously the other force, it's the Iran and the various Shiite in the 4 Arab states that Iran penetrated. And so we have kind of very complicated regional game. And we have to add the 3 great powers, US, China, and Russia, and try to see if there is going to be a balance of power game between US and China, and what is the role of Russia, which still, achieved a certain accomplishment, especially in Syria. It's kind of also a winner, at least short-term winner of the Arab Spring, and what game it will play. And also for Israel, I mean, it's interesting that Israel is actually still, in addition to its success with the Sunni state, also with Russia, established kind of coordination or whatever, and that's according to foreign sources, Israel able to bomb in Syria and so on. What it will be, especially when Biden actually will have a more kind of, let's say, problematic relation with critical relation with Russia. It will be completely different atmosphere than under Trump. So how Israel will find itself between the two, while exerting pressure on Biden to be very hardline against Iran. So that makes it for a very complex. But we have to identify the key games, what are the key players, and how the kind of the balancing between them will shape the different games. And that's kind of a very good subject for PhD dissertation, MA thesis, and maybe for us still to publish, which, somewhat, but very challenging. The Middle East, it gives us a lot of room for research and publication, and for students for thesis and dissertations.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Professor Halijak, would you like to react, or do we go on to collect other questions? Please unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay. As far as the United States and European Union question concerned, I see more complementarity between both in strategy of both sides, because United States is delivering hard and military assurances for the region and Israel, while the European Union, within its Mediterranean strategy, is providing more soft instrument in the form of economic assistance, supporting for education program, and building civil society especially in Arab countries. So I see more coordination in approach between both sides in their approach to the region. Both sides has its own specialization and strength. As far as the Iraq concerned, I argue that the United States intervention paved the way for an increasing role of Iran in the region, because it opens a corridor of communication between Iran through the northern Iraq to the Syria and other parts of the region. So the United States made Iran great again. This is my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Halijak. So we go on to another round of questions, and I would now like to ask Rafał Ulatowski if, there we go.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Gregory Goss about US, China, oil and environment. China is now the biggest consumer of the Middle Eastern oil. China has launched future contracts for pricing oil, and the Biden administration will be probably much more pro-environmental than Trump administration or than any other previous US administration. So my question is Biden anti-carbon policy actually weakening the US dollar and the US and the position of the US economy in the world and especially in the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Rafał. Do we have other questions from the audience? If not, I have another question here in the chat, which I will address to the entire panel. We have a question, I quote, "Commander of American forces in the Middle East just announced the increase of the contingent of troops and the number of troops and bases in the Middle East, considering the conflict with Iran. Is it a real plan in the context of the dialogue with Iran?" So again, an Irani issue and perhaps US trying to gain more leverage in the negotiations with going back to the Iran deal. So with these two questions, I leave it to the panelists to address whichever they choose.
I'm happy to take the first one about China and American energy policies. Look, my view of China, and I'm not a China expert, so I'm happy to be educated by folks on the call who are. My view is that China is acting less as a great power competitor right now with the United States in the Middle East and more as a consumer. Yes, they have a strategic relationship with Iran that I think the Iranians wanted more than the Chinese, but China is also buying a lot of oil from the Arab side of the Gulf. I think right now China's major focus on the Middle East is maintaining the Middle East as an energy resource. And so I do think that you know, my joke on this to my students is always, are the Chinese going to think like economists, or are they going to think like political scientists? Because if they think like economists, they'll free ride on American military presence in the region and just keep buying energy and selling goods. If they think like political scientists, then they're going to have to start playing balance of power politics in the Middle East. That's not impossible, but right now I think they're thinking like economists. I think that American energy policy is going to have a long-term impact on the region, but not a short-term impact. If the Biden administration can successfully move the US more toward a green economy, that just further diminishes the importance of the region, because it diminishes the importance of oil in the global economy and reduces global demand for oil. But in the short term, I don't think it makes that much difference. The United States has never been interested in the Middle East because of the oil it gets from the Middle East. Right? It was interested in the Middle East because of the centrality of Middle Eastern oil in the world oil market. And it seems to me that continues to be the case. I think that there's a lot of talk in Washington about energy independence, which in and of itself is a concept that needs to be unpacked, which we don't have time for today. But I think that that concept overemphasizes the importance of Middle East oil for the United States itself in the way the United States over time has strategically thought about the Middle East. So I think long term, you move to a more green economy, the Middle East is going to have to start exporting sunshine and not hydrocarbons. But in the short term, I don't see in the next 4 years that those moves would have an appreciable impact on US policy toward the Middle East or the Middle East's importance in the world energy scheme.
I'll go ahead and take the other question about the military moves vis-a-vis Iran. Just broadly, because I don't know what the specific move that was discussed here is, but based on sort of my understanding and conversation with military leaders and my advising administration in the past, obviously some of those moves are purely political, and particularly when they come from the top. But most of them are really not. And there is the military has a definition of its what they call their deterrence posture vis-a-vis Iran, and they calibrate their moves depending on how they read the Iranians. And they also have theories about how the Iranians read each move, and they do them gradually depending how they want them to be received. So
Shibli, you muted yourself.
Sorry about that. These things are constantly happening, and they're constantly calibrated. There's not much to read into them most of the time, because they're just at a basic operational level, intended as a message from one military to the other, rather than necessarily entailing some big shift in policy.
May I comment on Greg distinction between economists and political scientists? That's very, very tempting. Can I go ahead?
Professor Benji, you have your microphone off, so perhaps we'll have first Professor Miller and then.
Okay, sure.
Hey, Professor Miller, please.
Okay, yeah, I think definitely up to a certain period of time, Greg is absolutely right. So long you can be a free ride and a security umbrella of another power, that makes a lot of sense. However, once you become a great power competitor of this provider of security umbrella, then you change your policy. And we saw that in Chinese behavior in Asia Pacific in recent years, in the South China Sea, most notably. Now it's behavior, with India, the conflict in the Himalaya and so on. So, and since China depends on Middle Eastern oil, it wouldn't like to depend on its key source, on such a vital source, and the security provided by its opponent, by its great power competitor at the very least. So I think the kind of the balance of power game will enter into the Middle East, also in China-US relations, and it will play some role. About the military moves, I don't think that's the Biden policy vis-a-vis Iran. Will be definitely in the first. There will be a major attempt to revive diplomacy and negotiation around the nuclear deal, because that's a key interest of the Biden administration. If we said the Biden administration focus on the transnational threats, obviously non-proliferation is one of them. And the way to do it will be, in the Biden's administration view, will be this multilateral agreement with Iran, together with the European and with the other great powers. So I don't think that the military move will play here, definitely not initially, will play a major role in this respect. The attempt will be to try to restore trust in the relation and to revive the nuclear deal, even though it's extremely difficult because of the various criticism of the deal, the pressure exerted by Israel and the Sunni states, and the question of sanction, whether the Biden administration will immediately abandon all the Trumpist sanction on Iran, or will it try to use it as some leverage in order to improve a little bit, to change somewhat, to revise the original nuclear deal. And that's a very tough question for the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Miller. Professor Ben-Zvi, you have just turned on your microphone.
Yes. Okay. Actually, I'm in basic agreement with whatever was stated, but still, I don't think that we need to read Robert Jervis in order to reach a conclusion that Biden would like perhaps to augment his conciliatory gestures, or since we are on the verge of renewing diplomatic negotiations with Iran, and since the emphasis was put on diplomacy, soft power diplomacy, engagement, so he must somehow decouple it and avoid from any show or demonstration of weakness. So to avoid any projection of image of weakness, I think maybe it's a deliberate gesture, a kind of saber rattling maybe. Don't take us as conciliatory, we are not for appeasement. So sometimes you have to try and synchronize your actions and to introduce an element of potential deterrence, potential coercion, maybe to reassure the Saudis, in order to project, to signal to Iran that, look, we are not disengaging, we are not leaving the scene, we still have power, and watch out. So maybe it's a subtle signal, maybe I read too much into it, but I think it's basically a desire to limit or to manage the cost of engaging in a diplomatic initiative. And well, the stick and the carrot, it sounds simplistic, outdated, but maybe it's true.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have Professor Halejak. Would you like to react?
Okay. If we assume that the Middle East region will be in a near future area of confrontation or cooperation between United States and China, so the very interesting questions occur: how it influences on the logic of internal relations and the behavior of a particular state. So the Cold War model, when the Soviet Union and the United States compete very heavily, bring about a lot of insecurities and instability. But this is a very interesting distinction made by Professor Gregory. If China will behave according to the geoeconomic standard, then China will need a guarantor of the sea lanes, of oil sea lanes. So the China will be ready to accept the United States hegemony, and it will be in the interest of both sides to keep this system of bipolar world, because frankly speaking, we are entering slowly but steadily into the new bipolarism, and the Middle East will be an interesting, field of experience of this new bipolar era.
Okay, so with new bipolarity, we have to end our discussion today. It's 5 p.m. in Central European time, and our time is up. So with this, I would very much like to thank our distinguished panel for this very interesting, very deep, and very important discussion. And I would also like to thank very much all of you experts who have been with us on this Zoom call, and all of the viewers that have streamed us via YouTube. And thanks very much to Jakub Zajączkowski, who has put this entire feat together. And so congratulations on ending the series of the 4 seminars in such an interesting manner. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I would like also to thank all our panelists. And as Jan said, we have just finished our 4-part series of seminars, and I would like also to thank once again all our colleagues from Charles University, from Haifa, Professor Miller, Professor Jan Hornat, from Mexico, Jorge Schiavon, my colleague, Professor Aleksandra Jarczewska, for preparing this 4-part series seminars, and it will be of course a possibility to watch this on YouTube. So if some of your colleagues or some of didn't have opportunity to listen today or previous seminar, everything will be possible on YouTube. So once again, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for a great discussion, debate, and I would like also to thank our audience to take part in today's seminar, for all questions, comments from your side. Thank you very much, and on behalf of Dean of our faculty, Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, University of Warsaw, Professor Daniel Pfastek, great thanks for you, and I hope we'll meet very soon, and we will have also opportunity to discuss further about all this issue which today was discussed during this seminar. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening, day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I have a request to you because